but we wanted to first start it off with hearing some words from General Baker about kind of the history of struggle in this city, in this country, as well as what it means for us today.
Sure.
I mean, why do we need, why do we need these leaders? Why do we need this movement? Why do we need to have folks that are doing this work together? So we appreciate you having this time with us, and we appreciate everyone being here. And make yourself comfy, and I want to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Let everybody get
This
seated.
might be an opportunity for folks that
Yeah,
stand
come on,
and
guys.
get a chair.
Come get a
Chairs
chair.
over
Yeah.
here.
And if there's any way to, I hope you guys don't mind that. Okay, great.
Well, good evening. Good evening, General. What a pleasure. I first want to thank you all for this golden opportunity. I don't feel like I deserve all of y'all. You know, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about the history of struggle and the task that we got in front of us. You know, and it's really touching for me because, you know, coming through some of the struggles we came through in the past, I didn't think I lived long enough to be explaining some of this to people and sharing those experiences. So I really want to thank you in that regard. Well, let me say, I'm like I was saying last night, I'm homegrown. I was born here in Detroit by my parents were sharecroppers from Georgia. They came following Ford's cry for 5 hours a day in the auto plants in 1941. I spent my life working in these auto shops. You know, I spent 40 years in the auto plants. I got hired in 1963, and I retired in 2003. But it took me those 40 years to get 30 years seniority because I got fired so many goddamn times and transferred and switched and changed names so many times, you know, that I couldn't get but 30 years credit for the 40 I did. Okay, so the experience we share ain't legal experiences, you know. They're experience that we got through struggle properly. Y'all excuse me for a minute. I cut off this phone. Yeah, let me do this. I'm sorry about that. I should have known better. Okay, let's see. Let me tell you secondly that I'm even though I'm a retired auto worker, I'm married. Marion Kramer is my wife. We got 7 kids, you know, and 6 grandchildren. So we're not struggling for a nation of ghosts.
Yeah.
We think that if we're going to win this struggle, we got to have some people here to help carry it through. She's downstairs in the plenary today, and she's a little bit angry at me because I'm up here and she down there. but that's the way it fails. Let me say this, that you know, some of my experience, I mean, Detroit is an auto town. And when we say that, we mean that in a real way. There was at one point the Chrysler Corporation alone had 29 plants in the greater Detroit area. GM had another 15, Ford had another 10, and they had other kind of parts suppliers too. In 1966, Chrysler Corporation had 66,000 employees in Detroit. It was the largest employer in the city of Detroit. Now Chrysler Corporation ain't got but almost 20,000 employees nationwide. So you see how much it's failed. But back in those days, you know, when you grew up in this city, it was a booming time. You know, the auto industry came in the early 1900s. Matter of fact, at the turn of the century, Detroit led the nation in building iron stoves. You know, in 1901, 1902, iron stoves was the main product being built here in the city. And you know, the iron stove is a stove you use wood to cook in. So you show you how rapid things change. So the auto industry, as we know it, is a little more than just 100 years old. It's not much more than that. And we probably, you know, when the auto industry came in this city, you know, the horseless carriage paved the way with Henry Ford and his discussions on the moving assembly line that actually changed things. So this city grew and grew and grew based on the demand for labor in the auto industry. I think at one point when Ford decided to pay $5 a day, which wasn't really true. I mean, that's the story that's out there about $5 a day. But you had to fit in a real special category to get that $5. You know what I mean? Everybody didn't get the $5, and the $5 didn't last that long. But just to cry for $5 a week when people were making $5 a day, when people were making $6 a week, was quite an improvement in life. And that's what draw people from foreign lands, from Appalachia, from the Deep South, all over. People poured into Detroit, looking for work. In that situation, the auto industry began to collapse early. We had the cyclical crisis of production going up and then falling down because it overproduced. By the time we got to the Great Depression, in 1929, most of the auto plants were shut down. And you really talk about the organizational history of this working class in this city developing during and after the Depression. It was in 1932 we had what's been called the historic Hunger March in the city of Detroit. And it was during that Depression, that these unemployed councils developed all over the city. And they were basically ethnic based, because you had every ethnic configuration that you could think of. Henry Ford was a specialist in making sure that all the people he had ethnic breakdowns so they couldn't communicate with one another, and therefore he could keep union drives out of there. And those are the conditions that he fought for and he built. What happened in the course of that was these ethnic movements developed unemployed councils based on neighborhoods. And the unemployed councils got so strong about in 1932 and 33, where the unemployment in Detroit got to be about 50%, that they began to fight the evictions. So they were putting people back in their homes, and they were doing that with a frenzy. I don't know the brother not here that was on the front page of the PT that's being evicted out of Toledo. Did you see the People's Tribune with the guys with the jack boots evicted him out of his house? And they dressed up like stormtroopers. You know what I mean? But anyway, those kind of conditions exist in that period of time, and these unemployed councils developed to try to put people back in. We had a couple of situations that developed in which these unemployed councils decided that they had to take this fight for hunger against the automobile manufacturers. And so they decided that they go after Ford Motor Company, because General Motors had a lot of numerous plants, and so did Chrysler, but Ford had one big major facility out in River Rouge. By that time, the transfer had been made from Highland Park to River Rouge. At that River Rouge plant, at that time, they had about 80,000 employees at that one plant. So they decided that they would march on Ford, demanding jobs so they could eat. So these tens of thousands of unemployed people, in these unemployed movements, marched all over the city. We had a pretty progressive mayor of the city at that time named Frank Murphy. So what he did when the unemployed councils marched through the streets of Detroit, he gave them police escort because he knew they was going to Dearborn. So these unemployed movements merged, and they got to Dearborn with a crowd probably about 10,000, because the unemployed councils from the suburbs met them on Miller Road in Dearborn. There they were stopped by the Dearborn police, told them they couldn't go any further. The unemployed councils had a democratic decision to go ahead and march on. As they marched up Miller Road, first they were hit with fire hoses by the Dearborn Fire Department that watered them down. This was on March 11th in 1932, so it was really cold in Detroit on those days. They marched further, and the Dearborn police sent horses after them and started stomping them. And by the time they got to Gate 4, they opened up with machine gun fire. Wow. And 5 workers were shot and killed, and another 25 or so were wounded. And the Hunger March stopped. What grew out of this was the largest mass funeral ever held in this city, where 65,000 piled into downtown Detroit, and participated in the funeral procession for these 4. It was 5 killed, but 1 died later who was black. So the four, they had a funeral for the four, and the black guy was, they cremated him and spread his ashes over the Rouge plant because they couldn't bury him in the same cemetery with the white guys that was killed because we had the segregated cemeteries at that period of time in history. Out of this anger that grew out of this massacre that took place at Ford Motor Company. Now you got to understand, ain't nobody ever been brought to trial or charged with nothing, and Ford they never been held accountable, for this murder on the streets. But out of this mass drive became the seeds for organized labor to try to organize the shops in the city. When Roosevelt was elected and the Wagner Act was passed, these same activists out of unemployed councils, they were communists and socialists of that day, took that struggle to organize in the shops. And they first had the big success at General Motors in Flint in '37 when they went in and had the sit-down strike at Flint. And after a long 60-some days with sit-in, they were victorious in getting a union contract at General Motors. Once that happened, the sit-down movement broke out spontaneously now. And the way history reads is sometimes that organized labor organized these people, but that's not the way history plays it. These developments became spontaneous. People sat down themselves and called the union, said, "Come organize us." So the union didn't do it. I mean, the women at the dime stores and millineries and restaurants all over town sat down and started calling the CIO, come over here and sign us up. So you see these movements break out spontaneously. They are not organized. They're not conspiracies. People take it up on themselves to take up the challenge once they see a victory. And that's the way that thing developed. And most of the auto industry was organized at that period of time, except Ford Motor Company. Ford Motor Company had a different history. When they attempted to organize Ford Motor Company with the same tactics that they used at GM and Chrysler, they were soundly defeated, and that's what's called the Battle of the Overpass. And that's when Walter Reuther and those other leaders of the union were beaten by those thugs that Henry Ford had hired, and it beat back the organizing drive. Now the main reason that they could not organize Ford because Ford Motor Company had hired almost 17,000 African American workers in that Ford Rouge plant. And because of the particular conditions they were confronted with, they had a particular solid loyalty to Henry Ford. They didn't give a damn about a union. And most of the unions at that time still had discriminatory clauses. And they had no reason to try to trust a union over Henry Ford. Henry Ford, when he hired them in, not only confined them to the foundries, but he had blacks appointed to stamping plants and assembly plants. He had upgraded them throughout the industry, so it was a real solid loyalty, to Henry Ford. And therefore, they had to back up and regroup and recognize how to deal with this dynamic, that they confronted with here in the Rouge plant. What happened was that they finally developed an organizing committee for the black community. They made decisions to bring Paul Robeson into Detroit. John L. Lewis flew up with the coal miners, and the coal miners took up the task of organizing the Ford Rouge plant. I guess John L. Lewis and them took the dues of the coal miners to organize the auto workers, and I thought that was a gracious statement in his part. When you gotta tell your membership, look, we can't advance 1 ounce unless we organize this other section. So we got to take our dues and do that. With this effort of bringing John L. Lewis and having these huge rallies at the Olympia Stadium and organizing the progressive black preachers in this, Reverend Charles Hill and a few other ones, and had them actually preaching at the factory gates, that they finally was able to break this thing and organize Ford in 1941. And so once that broke through, you had the big militant local out of Local 600 that ended up being the best local that we ever had. That local understood what solidarity meant. Rest of the locals didn't. That local understood what discrimination would get you. The rest of the locals didn't. So we had that one big progressive local that developed, and it's still that way today. Almost all the black leaders in the UAW, that rise up, come out of Local 600 because it's different. In 1941, things changed rapidly. Most of you know this stuff, and I'm just going to repeat it to you. But you know, the war broke out. Ford was organized in April of 41. Pearl Harbor Day was December of 41. Once Pearl Harbor Day came, there wasn't a single new car built between 1941 and 1945. I know you all know that. And please don't go out looking for a 1942 something or another, because it don't exist. The entire auto industry was transformed into war production. The government covered the cost of production plus 10%. So the companies didn't care how many people they hired, because they were going to be covered by the government costs. In the process of this, Detroit became one massive sea of humanity. People came from everywhere. Streetcars ran all night and all day. All the plants ran 24/7. Massive amounts of production. The Ford Willow Run plant was built in Willow Run that hired 42,000 people. That's why we saw Rosa the Riveter out there riveting airplanes together. We ran PT boats at the plant that I worked in. Armaments and tanks were made all over the city. So that actually changed the whole character of production, but it became a sea of humanity in this city. So that's kind of the important history early on of the development of the industry and the organization of labor in this country. We had all kind of conflicts in the midst of the war. The stories I tell from the old guy, had an old guy, Dave Moore, I used to run with. He passed away last year. He was 97 years old, just articulate. And he was telling me about how during the war, when they was building all these trucks, the Teamster unions would not allow blacks to drive these trucks. They had Army trucks parked up all over Livernois, all over these streets, and white workers was killing themselves trying to drive all these trucks to the Army bases. So these blacks appealed to try to figure out a way for them to break through, had all kind of resistance from the Teamsters. They had to end up appealing to Eleanor Roosevelt to get them to break the discrimination and allow them to drive those trucks and get them to the Army bases, else they'd have been stuck there behind some discrimination. The other part that we had was during middle of the war, we had these racial riots that broke out in Detroit. We had, when black workers first entered the Packard plant in assembly positions, all the whites walked out. Same thing had happened at Temple Axle. So you had this strife that existed on the plants where blacks were supposed to stay in janitorial jobs or foundries and were not supposed to integrate in the final assemblies. They had a housing project that they built here. It was a government project named the Sojourner Truth Projects that originally was built for the black population that was expanding as people poured into the city. And when it actually got built, they said blacks can't have it now. We're going to give it to whites. All kind of conflicts broke out over that. But then so this rebellion spilled over in the street in 43. Those riots lasted for about 3 or 4 days in the midst of World War II, where we should have been fighting Hitler. Troops had to be brought back home to stop the racial unrest in 43. The same thing happened in Mobile, Alabama. I don't know if anybody from that area that's here today, but in Mobile it was even worse than that because they were building those big ships in the shipbuilding industry. When blacks first went in there to do welding, whites walked off or jumped them and refused to let them do it. So, you know, you had those kind of conflicts that developed. But things got better and went on. To show you the solidarity that existed at this Rouge plant, I had this other guy running Quill Petway, and he was worked in the tool and die plant, which was a building that had mainly Anglo-American workers. And he said that during the riots, he was missing for 4 days. He couldn't go to work. And when he went back to work the next day, when he walked in the plant, all the white workers was cheering the fact that he was still alive. So it shows you the kind of solidarity that developed in that one shop that meant so much, to them. So those are the struggles that developed early on throughout the war years, and those struggles continued. But they're important for you to know because at that period in history, over half of the factory workers, over half of the black factory workers that lived in Detroit worked for Henry Ford, which was a tremendous part. But I think that background I'm telling you is how Detroit became a black city. that all those factory workers, that was not the intent of Henry Ford. He was hiring them all to keep them from building a union and uniting with the rest of the white workers. But the end results of that ended up building a huge black middle class in this city that grew up on the basis of that. And I think it's important for you to know in terms of understanding how this city got the way it did. It wasn't accidental, wasn't nothing magic about it. Hell, Henry Ford was trying to keep workers from organizing, and he got the different results from what he angled for. So those are the early struggles that we had in the city. Meanwhile, Detroit prospered. We had the largest amount of single home dwellings of any city in the country. Detroit is a city of 139 square miles, and we had all of these single homes, and not a lot of apartment buildings or brownstones. Everybody had single homes. I used to work in the factory. I have factory workers were so proud of their homes they'd carry pictures of their houses in their wallets. Ain't that something? I'm so glad this mine. That kind of pride, in the fact that they got to be homeowners. So that was the background to a lot of those struggles in that period. By the time we get to the mid-1950s now, after the war, then we see the plants begin to diminish. Matter of fact, anybody drove a Packard lately? Anybody seen one of them Packard cars? You driving down the street of Packard? Well, listen. Over on the east side here in the city, we got the Packard plant still sitting there. The last Packard rolled off the line in 1953. And the Raggedy factory still sitting over there on the boulevard in Mount Elliott like a big old sore. They done tore down all kind of stuff since then. And they gonna put it on us, right? Like, this part of the old blighted old neighborhood. We didn't do that. We didn't have nothing to do with no Packard. Packard left, Studebaker closed. Kaiser and Frazier went out of business. All of those places, those old cars you used to know that were made here, they all split, so those were gone. And we ended up having, at that time, the big four, because we had Chrysler, Ford, GM, and American Motors. You forgot about that one, too. American Motors used to exist. They used to make the Nash, and the little Henry J, and they made the Jeeps. Okay, so we had the big four then. Was another one I missed? The Rambler. Okay, so that's the kind of production stuff that we had here in the city. But these plants began to break up in the 50s and move. They started moving to suburban areas because they were afraid of union organizing. Coming out of World War II, after the war, there was a whole wave of strikes because during the war we had no strike clauses. The workers couldn't strike because striking would affect the war production. So as soon as the war was over, workers started striking everything, and the soldiers came home. And that's what set the groundswell for the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, that ended up leading to the right to work states in the South and all that in 1947. So by the time you get to 53s, they start breaking up the plants, start building suburban plants, sending the plants, other places to try to minimize union power inside those plants. So that's what we went through in the 50s. And ever since then, in the 50s, we've been in a crisis in this city with overproduction, and companies moving and leaving. Some started to go south, others just closed altogether, and the city began to change. By the 1960s now, that's when I was able to get a job. 1958 was probably one of the worst years in the auto industry. That's when the Edsel was produced by Ford, which was the worst car ever produced in the auto industry. The massive Edsel came out. And I don't know if they sold 5 or 10 or 15 of them cars, but it was the worst one that ever came out. And but it kind of marked the point where most of the auto industry laid off everybody. And people didn't get picked back up until about 1962. After the Kennedy election and the early beginnings of the outbreak of the Vietnam War, then auto production began to pick up. I got a job in 1963. I don't know how much culture you stay up on, but what was it, the Stylistics or one of those singing groups had a tune out in the late 50s called Get a Job. Get a job. Because you couldn't get one. So they had a tune called Get a Job. Matter of fact, it was about 1963 when Smokey Robinson and them answered it after they started hiring. He said, I got a job. Finally got a job. You know, so the cultural movement kind of followed, you know, the economic movement in the city. Well, you know, when I got a job in 1963, I got a job. We were making the front ends and back ends for the Mustang. You know, the new Mustang came out in 1964, and it sold for $1,500 brand new. $1,500 brand new. And that's when Wilson Pickett broke out with his song Mustang Sally, because it was ruled as a woman's car. This new Mustang. So the 60s saw the development of work inside the shops expanding. Matter of fact, when I hired in I hired in the Ford in 1963, but I didn't last long. You know, I lasted about 9 months and got fired. So I had to go to Dodge Main and get a job. But see, back then, jobs were so plentiful. You could work day shift here, get fired or quit and go over here and work afternoons at the next plant. You could just pick your way. It was simply that easy. So when I hired in at the Dodge Main plant in 1964, they hired a whole shift at once. So 5,000 of us went in there together. The Dodge Main plant had 10,000 employees. They put a whole second shift on, hiring 5,000 people at a time. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of how massive hiring was and how lucrative things was at that period of time. No, Alonzo over there back hiding, he went into plants back there too. But anyway, that was the kind of the mood of the city during that period of time. What happened was that obviously the rest of these plants hadn't changed. We had all kind of discrimination inside the shop. You got hired, when I got hired at Dodge Main, I go in with a white buddy of mine. I end up in the foundry and he end up my foreman. You know, or I end up, you know, in spot welding and body shop and he end up in skilled trades. You know, discrimination was just that tough. You know, you couldn't get the kind of positions that was held open mainly for blacks at a lot of these Chrysler and GM plants was real discriminatory. And that's what set the basis for us began organizing inside the shops. We began to do organizing work inside the factories after the rebellion, but I talked a little bit about that last night on the plenary, you know, during the rebellion in 1967, when Detroit exploded like that. First of all, I just want to say it's a real joy to stand here today and see all you young people. It just makes your heart lift and think that we got hope we can win this struggle. Well, let me tell you, I'm homegrown. I was born here in Detroit in September the 6th, 1941, at the old St. Alban Hospital. Dr. Ocean Sweet delivered me, slapped me on my butt when I came out of my mama's womb. So he not only gave me my birthright, but passed on a legacy of struggle, and I tried to live to carry that out the rest of the days of my life. Let me just say this, the Detroit Rebellion in 1967 is a defining moment in this city's history. I, at that time, was working at the Dodge Main plant. We were working 12 hours, 7 days a week. I didn't get off work on the afternoon shift till 3 a.m. in the morning, and everybody that got off with me went to various blind pigs all over the city. It was part of our life. You work afternoon shift, get off and go to the blind pig because the bar is closed, and that became part of your daily activity. So when the rebellion broke out in about 6 o'clock that morning on 12th Street in Claremont, I was right there, Johnny, on the spot. I was living 3 blocks from there on Gladstone. After the police came and tried to raid the blind pig, and it was surrounded by about 100 workers on the street that started throwing bricks at the police, then people broke down the street and went to the pawn shops first. Now, you got to understand a thing about that almost everybody back then lived off the pawn shop. You work and get paid on Friday, go buy you some stuff, and by Wednesday the next week, you had to put it in the pawn shop to have enough to eat the next 2 days. And if you ever pawned anything, you know, on the back of your pawn slip, it says in great big letters, not responsible for fire, theft, or other unavoidable accidents. So everybody, the first people that went into the pawn shops had to go in there to try to get their own stuff back. Obviously, they took somebody else's when they was in there. I was arrested on the first night for violation of curfew and did 15 days in Ionia State Penitentiary waiting to come back to trial. It's a lot of characteristics of the Detroit Rebellion that was different than other rebellions. First of all, everybody proclaims that the Detroit Rebellion was integrated. The first person killed in the Detroit Rebellion was a white worker that was looting a store down on Trumbull. When they carried me to Ionia, I had 2 white guys on my bus that was arrested for sniping. Secondly, the Detroit Rebellion is the only one that had an assassination that took place during the course of the rebellion, and that's the Algiers incident, the Algiers Motel incident that no longer exists. The first thing they did was rename it to the Desert Inn, and that lasted a few years, and now they closed it. And when you get to Virginia Park and Woodward, it's a gated community with a brick wall there, and the Algiers Motel have been wiped off the pages of history. And when you go to the school systems in the city, you can't find the book, The Algiers Motel Incident, because they don't want kids to know about it. The other factor of the Detroit Rebellion that made it different was they arrested so many people. They arrested over 7,000 people during the Detroit Rebellion. They sent us to Marquette, Milan, Jackson, up with me at Ionia. They filled up all the prison systems in the state. And when they was finished with that, they sent the rest of the people to Belle Isle. So when you talk about Belle Isle as a place for lecture, it became a jail. We called it Belcatraz. The other factor I think is important to know that those National Guards shot up this city. Anybody that went into the rebellion that didn't hate the police had to hate them when the rebellion was over. They shot over 150,000 rounds of ammunition with those 50 caliber machine guns over this city. They had so many shell casings laying on the ground that we picked up the empty 50 caliber machine gun shells, put rawhide on them, and wore them for necklaces as a symbol to the rebellion. I don't know if any of y'all remember that. But the biggest lesson that we learned out of rebellion was that when they established curfew, if you got sick, you couldn't go to the hospital. If you got hungry, you couldn't go to get no food. But if you had a badge from Chrysler, Ford, or General Motors, you would get through the police line, the National Guard line, and the Army line to take your butt to work. We learned a fundamental lesson out of that the only place that black people had any value in the society was at the point of production. And that's why we turn our efforts towards organizing in the factory. And within a year's time after the Detroit Rebellion, drum was born. And that was the basis of our struggle and the drum movement that grew out of that. The stress I wanted to make was where the struggle to organize the workers came from. It drew out of the rebellion. We learned a fundamental lesson, took that lesson, applied it, and was victorious with it for a while. Ron, I'm going to pass you the torch. So in a lot of ways, that's been a history of the city. You know, that work we had to fight the company and the union. You know, the union was so bad, we developed a slogan that says the UAW means you ain't white. It was that bad. We had picket lines around Solidarity House and everything. We couldn't even get a conversation with them. We go out to try to talk to them about discrimination. They said the only discrimination that exists in the union is that you started. You know, so anyway, we was just in a lockdown battle. We developed organizations in the factories to fight back, and we had to be careful. We learned some lessons about those organizations. We had to develop an organization that wasn't a caucus, that didn't follow union rules. Because if you develop an organization like that, then the rules of that organization alone shuts you down. I got fired in leading the Wildcat strike at that plant, and we decided to use my discharge as a calling card to build an organization called DRUM, which meant Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. And what we decided was that we used it to say that you have declared war on us, and that's the only decision that you'll make. We'll decide the conditions of war, the time of the engagement, and where we're going to engage with, and we're going to decide all those things. So that freed us up from the constraints are being boxed in under some of their rules. We're going to decide, we're going to fight you everywhere we can. And that became the way that we proceeded, to try to organize ourselves, and that's precisely what we did. We fought them everywhere. We followed labor reps home. They hired a couple of black labor reps, and they come in the plant, start firing people, and drive home in the black community. Me and Lonzo, we locked and loaded and drove up to his house and parked in the driveway, wait for his ass to come home. You ain't gonna come in there and fire somebody and come back in the black community and live down there. And he called his wife and had his wife come out and beg him to please leave because he's scared he ain't gonna come home. We took on the battle. We won't messing with no grievance procedure. We messing with whatever we got to do to try to get this thing. We catch the Urban League giving Lynn Townsend, the CEO of Chrysler, award. We went in there with picket signs, kicked over the damn tables and shit. You ain't gonna give him no damn award with the hell we catch him in. So we took the fight. We decided where the battleground gonna be, not you. I ain't sitting up looking at no grievance procedure, waiting on you to WWP it after it gets a year and a half old. So then we took on that fight, and we began to build based on putting out flyers. Dodge Main was so big with 10,000 people. People on one end of the plant didn't know what was going on in the other end of the plant. So we decided what we needed is a newsletter. So we developed one little newsletter that we put out once a week. First day we go out to pass out the newsletter, the security guys come out taking pictures of the workers and gonna use them for discipline. So the high school kids, there's a little waistline over there, right there with the black shirt on. He was a high school kid, about 14 years old. The kids came out and said, listen, we'll go out and pass out the leaflets for you. They can't fire me because it'll be another 10 years if I'm old enough to have it. All right. So the kids came out and became the shock troops for us, and they passed out the flyers. And we finally what happened after about 9 weeks of putting out leaflets, workers said, well, look, y'all, excuse my French, y'all talking shit, what you gonna do? It's time to do something. So we had to do something. So we decided we'd strike the plant. We didn't want to strike it right away. We had a series of things we were gonna do called testing the strength. We had look at the Dodge Main plant. Let me tell you a couple things about Dodge Main plant. When you come out of the back of the Dodge Main plant, they had 3 bars, 2 delicatessens, and a motel. As soon as you come out the plant, they had it set up so you can lose every dime you made before you get before you get a block away from the plant. They used to bring a Brinks truck out to the plant that had check cashing windows in it. And on Thursday night on the afternoon shift, when the young workers would come out for lunch, they had wives and girlfriends pulling up there trying to get the check before you got home with it. Give you some food to eat so you pass the check on to go back to work. But it was a real live situation. But we had about 100 people that used to go behind the bars in the alley, and they'd work one shift and drink another. Yeah. So they'd work 8 hours and drink 8 hours. So it was good for us because we had an automatic base. 100 folks in that alley all the time that we could count on for whatever we wanted to do. Those was our troops. So when we got ready to have rallies and things at the local, we go back and get our troops out of the alley and we march down to the local hall. We surround them in the local hall and put forth resolutions and things like that. So we decided that we're gonna we weren't gonna strike them right away, but one of the guys got excited and damn it called for a strike the next morning, and all the guys stormed out, and we're sitting there waiting. Everybody gone now. We're gonna have to strike. We had a little coffee shop at that time that we used to run at night called the Ghetto Coffee Shop, and guys would be in there playing conga drums and drinking coffee and stuff all night. So we got those guys, and we had all the people around the newspaper. We had Inner City Voice, and we got in cars and drove out to the plant that morning. But the main thing we did, we took the conga drum players. We had conga drums playing in the coffee shop. We took the conga drum players with us out to the plant. And we lined them conga drums up at the plant gate and started passing out flyers and with the drums kicking and everything. And in a half-hour time, we had about 5,000 black workers lined up on the streets, that would refuse to go in. At that time, they had state troopers with high-powered rifles on top of the plant. the Hamtramck police and the Detroit police had us in a pincher movement. They're coming with them double-edged axe handles, and all our people were breaking our bars and beer bottles trying to figure out a way to fight. We were able to quickly get them in cars and take them down to Solidarity House, which was the Union headquarters, and have a picket over there and one at Chrysler headquarters. So we were able to diffuse that battle that we were going to get slaughtered in. But at the same time, let me tell you that Chrysler Corporation didn't know what to do with this strike. They declared it to be an extra legal strike instead of illegal. So nobody got fired, you know. They didn't know, they were scared. They were scared, they didn't know what to do with it. And so what happened was that workers started coming from everywhere after they heard about Trump. They came from the Eldon plant where Alonzo was. They came from Ford Roos. Everybody wanted to run. They wanted to run a revolutionary union movement in their plant. We couldn't handle that. We told them, listen, we have paper and we have ink. We have typesetting equipment and we got a mimeograph machine. And we have some young kids that'll help you distribute it. You write your own flyer. We'll help you print it, and we'll let the kids help you pass it out. We cannot handle all these different organizations coming at us. And I want to explain to you that because I think it's a difference between a movement and an organization. A movement breaks out spontaneously, and that's what happened. These movements broke out at all these factories and even other workplaces like Detroit News. And the organizations are always running around trying to catch it. So I want you to understand, I think it's an important lesson to know the movements are spontaneous, they break. You got to be prepared for them when you see them so you can take advantage of them. But that's the way history poses itself for us. But anyway, those movements grew in that sense, and our movement went on. We developed whatever we could, but by the time we get to the late 70s, the auto plants began to collapse. I think we had the collapse of the Chrysler plant in '79. That's when Chrysler Corporation applied for the loan guarantees for the government. And ever since then, brothers and sisters, it's been one decline and collapse after the other. A good 2 years, a bad 3 years. Good 2, bad 3. And that's been the history of this auto industry. One thing happened in this last collapse last year. Well, this crisis was so deep this time that when Chrysler and GM went into bankruptcy, they both came out partially nationalized. The government, or we own a portion of GM and Chrysler. And I want to tell y'all that because the government don't seem to want to let you know. Yeah. But part of GM and Chrysler is yours, you know. So that's important because when something new happens, it gives us an opportunity to think of new things. You know, I couldn't have told people about, or if I told them about the nationalization of the company a few years ago, it'd been harder to believe. Now they can. They only partially nationalized, and our position really is that the whole thing should be nationalized and taken and run it in the interest of the workers and its communities, and not these CEOs, you know, who do nothing.
That's right.
They got a book coming out called Overhaul in the fall by who? I shouldn't have mentioned it because I can't think of his name. But he was one of these guys that helped take over GM. And he talked about what the culture was like at GM. He said the CEO of General Motors rides down to the headquarters with his car and parks it in the private garage and have it automatically washed, and then catches the private elevator up to his private office and close his private door and sit there on his private ass all the rest of the day and don't talk to no damn body. And that's his work. Yeah. And he gets millions of dollars for doing that. He don't do a damn thing. And he said when they got ready to bring the volatility package to the government, he blamed everything on the union and the economy. GM ain't done nothing wrong. You know, I mean, that's the kind of absurd stuff that happens with these CEOs. They don't do nothing. And the people that do nothing in society are the ones that get awarded the most. You know, they run around talking about I'm in mining, and they sitting on, what does the movie say, on the 99th floor of some office building, is talking about he in mining. Fingernails ain't been dirty in his goddamn life, and he talking about he in mining. He ain't nothing. So that's the kind of character of these clowns that we work for.
They give you little bullshit amounts of money for working, wages and so forth, and then they steal all that shit back from you in terms of the way he got his other things set up. His whole credit gimmick society, man, consumer credit, buy shit on credit. He give you a little bit of shit to cool your ass out, and then steal all that shit back with shit called interest, the price of money. Motherfuckers in non-producing, non-existent, industries, motherfuckers who deal with paper. There's a cat who will stand up and say to you, he's in mining. And he sits in an office, man, on the 199th floor in some motherfucking building on Wall Street, and he's in mining. And he has paper, certificates, which are embroidered and shit, stocks, bonds, debentures, obligations, He's in mining. And he's sitting up in Wall Street, and his fingernails ain't been dirty in his motherfucking life. He went to Phillips Andover or Exeter. He went to Harvard. He went to Yale. He went to the Wharton School of Business, and he's in mining. And the motherfuckers who deal with intangibles are the motherfuckers who are rewarded in this society. The more abstract and intangible your shit is, i.e. stocks. What is stocks? A stock certificate is evidence of ownership in something that's real. Ownership. He owns and controls and therefore receives, the benefit from. That's what they call profit. He fucking with shit in Bolivia. He fucking with shit in Chile. He's Kennecott. He's Anaconda. He's United Fruit. He's in mining. He's in what? He ain't never in his life produced shit. Investment bankers, stock brokers, insurance men. It's motherfuckers who don't do nothing. We see that this whole society, man, exists and rests upon workers, and that this whole motherfucking society controlled by this ruling clique is parasitic, vulturistic, cannibalistic, and is sucking and destroying, man, the life of motherfucking workers, and we have to stop it because it's evil.
The League of Revolutionary Black Workers originally came out of consolidation of organizations such as DRUM, which is Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, LRUM, which is the Eldon Avenue Gearing Axle, which is Eldon Revolutionary Union Movement. FRUM, which is the Ford Revolutionary Union Movement, comes out of the Fort Rouge Complex. And UPRUM, which is United Parcel Revolutionary Union Movement, basically Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, was the beginning of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. DRUM started from a grievance that the black workers had.
At the time, they were running 56 units or automobiles an hour on the line. There was no additional help. Workers were doing almost twice as much work one day as they were doing the day before. The foreman on the line, he has obligation to see that his section runs smoothly, and a lot of times, they'll notice defective automobiles going down the line. All he wants to do is get it the hell out of his area. Get that car out on the street, and edit by any means necessary. This is when we begin to realize we were in a twofold struggle. We soon started making demands that it would seem that the UAW should have been making, such as the demands on the production standards, the overtime. Workers were beginning to question just who did the UAW represent, the workers or the corporation.
And that's the kind of history of struggle that we done had here in this city. And that's the kind of crisis that we're confronted with now. So that's what you see. You see a city here on the verge of collapse. We got 40 square miles of empty land in Detroit. We got enough empty land in Detroit to hold all of Boston, Massachusetts, or all of San Francisco. That much vacant land. And it's all because of the blighted factories and some of the stuff we did ourselves. We used to have a thing in Detroit called Devil's Night. And we'd wait till, when all the workers started losing them houses in 79, that was before they had all these second mortgages and shit. You lost your house, you lost it. So the only thing guys could do was go out and torch it, burn that sucker down, and we'd wait till the Devil's Night, right, the night before Halloween, and the whole city would go up on fire. You burn the house down so you could collect at least some insurance money for the house. And that's what became Devil's Night. And everybody running around acting like, why is this city burning like this? Damn, you should stop and ask somebody. Hell, they used to have people, they'd fly reporters in from Japan and all over the world to come in to see Detroit burn. I don't know if you know the spectacle we had about Devil's Night. It was it had national prominence in that sense. But that was the root cause of it was material conditions, that people didn't want to have to get with that loss and you could burn it. Then folks started driving their cars down there, torching them when they lose. you know, and the beat goes on. But that's the struggles we've had here. That's kind of where we got to where we are now. That's the lessons that we've had in history that we've grown out of. And we stand here today trying to figure out how to ground ourselves on various fronts of struggle. We organize ourselves on various fronts. Right here is Sister Gwen and Sister Ann out of the Welfare Rights Movement. They organize on the welfare front, on the poverty front. All these old retirees I was pointing out to you, we organizing with health on the healthcare struggle. We got retirees for single payer. Look at all these these healthcare shirts we got in here, man. Get these people. Yeah, that's our call. We fight for single payer national health care, and we ain't taking no stuff. You know, so that's our battle front. So various fronts of struggle, you know, is how this thing got to go. You can't fight on every front.
No.
A person that tries to do everything does nothing. You know, I think how the Chinese parallel go, you like a man with 10 fingers trying to solve 10 problems, and you're sitting here paralyzed.
Yeah.
One fly under each finger. That ain't the way you kill a fly. Damn it, you let 9 go and kill them one at a time.
Yeah.
And that's the way you gotta carry on these fights. Figure out which front you want to fight on and throw everything you got on that front till you can make a breakthrough. And stay with it. Don't give up. You know, stay there, learn the lessons. Don't get tired and frustrated. You know, one of the things that happens all the time, and I always use this quote from Ingalls. He says, "What childish innocence it is to use one's own impatience as a theoretically convincing argument." You ain't got no right to get tired.
That's right.
You stay in the fight and stay there, because what happens most of the time, by the time people rise up, the revolutionaries done got tired and went on. There ain't nobody to lead. You know, so you stay in the fight. Well, anyway, those are lessons we done learned here in the city, y'all. I hope that's helpful some kind of way. You know? Sure. Listen, let me tell you this. I haven't made probably an independent decision in the last 40 years. They've always been collective. So I don't take individual responsibility for all the things I do, because 2 heads are better than one. And I was fortunate enough as a youngster to join. We had a little group when I was on college campus called Uhuru that was Swahili for Freedom. And it's out of that little group where we decided to make decisions to take on things. And it's so important to have a constant leadership development core that you got to work on all the time. I can jump all the way up to today. You see, I got Mitch and Waistline and Lonzo over here right now, and Charles. We decided to take on this struggle around healthcare. And in order to do that, we have 2 meetings a week we have to do. We got a meeting at Local 22 called Retirees for Single Payer, and then we meet Thursday down at the church and go over theoretical things and theoretical questions so we can tighten up our understanding of this world and strengthen our ability to go back to the meeting on Monday. And we have to do that as consciously as possible. We can't do one without the other. We got to have the theoretical struggle. But the struggle is the school itself. You got to study, but you got to struggle, because out of the struggle becomes the real educational lessons that you apply to things that you study. And that way it becomes real and live to you, and you really got to hold on to them. We used to have, one of the problems we had back in the 60s was that we'd have 35 workers over at the Unicom office ready to study Marxism as a science, and couldn't find nobody that could teach it. We spent money we sent for James Foreman and everybody else that run around talking about they was Marxists, and would bring them in here to try to study. They didn't know how to teach nothing. And we put them up. I mean, we give them a place to stay, something to eat, you know, come in here and teach, and we had to end up running them out of town. You know, see?
I heard that.
So the struggle for education was primary for us, battling to try to learn. you know, especially after the organization split and the little intellectual section left us, and we sitting up there looking at each other, we got to figure out how we're going to fight our way out of this. So it's indispensable that you keep a leadership core and you constantly study and reevaluate, you know, the work that you're doing so we can keep on struggling and fighting straight. You know, and that's really important. I was fortunate enough, Chris, to get through a lot of those early battles with the police. I mean, I didn't have too many awards, man. Most of the things I've done, I think I went to jail every year of my life from 1963 to 1971. And I finally met somebody who told me to sit my big butt down and study. You know, so it ain't like you learn. And you know, in the '60s left us with two type of people. We were talking about it earlier. It left us with those that fought and refused to think, and those that thought and refused to fight. So we had two kind of people.
Yeah.
You know, one of them sitting up talking stuff all the time, thinking, and the other one was fighting all the time, ain't got sense enough to study. It took us 20 years to try to make thinkers into fighters and fighters into thinkers. And when we get that dialected, then we got something to work with. But that was the kind of a past we had, and that's why you got to really fight for theory all the time. You got to fight for theory, do your theoretical study, and then carry it out and sum up those practices that you do, and keep an ongoing, steady leadership working, because we're going to be in for a long, difficult battle, and it's going to take time. We got to have a protracted outlook on this thing, you know. Chris, okay.